The room was supposed to feel ordinary. A simple community center with its beige walls, its squeaky folding chairs, and a long rectangular table pushed against the front of the room where the HOA board members sat like judges. But anyone who has lived under an HOA knows that these meetings are rarely ordinary. Beneath the dull hum of the overhead lights, tension brewed, invisible but sharp. People weren't just here to talk about landscaping or parking violations. They were here because something wasn't right, and one board member's behavior would soon shatter the illusion of calm. Residents shuffled in with paperwork under their arms, whispers bouncing off the walls. Some were irritated, some indifferent, and some quietly hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this meeting would address their frustrations. Among them sat retirees who had built their lives in the neighborhood, parents juggling restless kids, and younger homeowners just trying to keep up with mortgage payments and HOA fees. Each one carried their own story, their own reasons for being here, and all of them were about to witness something they wouldn't soon forget. The board sat at the front, each member adopting the posture of authority. But it was clear to those who had attended enough meetings that one figure dominated the stage. A man in his late 50s, sharp suit, thinning hair slicked back, eyes darting like he was constantly calculating. His name was Mr. Reynolds. To most, he wasn't just another board member. He was the board, loud, uncompromising, and, as many had come to suspect, drunk with the kind of power that comes when a small man is given control over his neighbors. At first, the meeting began with the usual motions: approval of last month's minutes, updates on the landscaping contract, a brief mention of the budget. But the tension wasn't in the agenda. It was in the way Reynolds leaned back in his chair, smirking as residents voiced concerns, interrupting them mid-sentence, dismissing their frustrations with a wave of his hand. It was in the way his voice, sharp and mocking, cut through the air like a blade. One woman, Mrs. Lawson, timid and elderly, raised her hand to speak about a fine she'd received for leaving her trash bin out too long. She explained, voice trembling, that her husband had recently undergone surgery, and she'd simply forgotten to bring it in. Most people expected compassion, or at least understanding. Reynolds responded with laughter. "Rules are rules," he said, his words laced with ridicule. "If we start making exceptions, this whole place falls apart." The laughter wasn't shared by anyone else in the room. Instead, people shifted uncomfortably, the humiliation hanging heavy in the silence. Someone in the back muttered, too quietly to be identified, "That's not leadership." And it wasn't. It was cruelty. But Reynolds thrived on that discomfort. He pushed it further. When another homeowner raised a question about the HOA's rising fees, Reynolds snapped back, "If you can't afford it, maybe you shouldn't be living here." The words landed like a slap. People stared in disbelief, caught between anger and shock. These weren't the words of a community leader. They were the words of someone who saw his neighbors not as people, but as nuisances to be controlled. And then, the cameras caught everything. In the age of smartphones, there are few places to hide. A young homeowner, new to the community, had decided to record the meeting for transparency. He'd heard rumors about how Reynolds treated people, and he thought it was time the truth was documented. As Reynolds raised his voice, mocking, cutting people off, and belittling residents, the camera kept rolling. What was captured that night would not only ripple through the neighborhood, but would eventually spread far beyond it. Because the moment Reynolds lost, control wasn't just about rude words or smug behavior. It was when he revealed the kind of arrogance that people only believe when they see it with their own eyes. Midway through the meeting, a homeowner named David stood up. "Calm but firm," he challenged Reynolds. "You don't speak to people like that. We live here. We pay dues. We deserve respect." The room shifted. For the first time, Reynolds wasn't in control. His face flushed. His voice rose. He jabbed a finger in David's direction, his words turning venomous. "You think you can tell me how to run this board? You're nothing but a complainer. People like you ruin communities." Gasps filled the room. Some homeowners exchanged wide-eyed looks. Others pulled out their phones, recording now openly. Reynolds didn't seem to care. He doubled down, slamming his hand against the table, shouting over David, dismissing him as if he were a child. It was ugly. And it was all on camera. The longer it went on, the more Reynolds exposed himself. His words grew harsher, his tone more aggressive, until he leaned so far across the table that it looked like he might leap out of his chair. People instinctively recoiled. Some even whispered, "Is he going to hit him?" That moment, caught in crisp audio and clear video, was the moment Reynolds' image collapsed. He wasn't the strong leader he thought he was. He wasn't protecting the community. He was bullying it, tearing down the very people he was supposed to serve. And when the video finally made its way online, the neighborhood would learn that they weren't alone. Thousands of others who lived under HOA rule would watch it, nodding with grim familiarity. They'd seen their own Reynolds before, in different faces and different neighborhoods, but the behavior was the same. The shocking behavior wasn't just one man losing his temper. It was a reflection of a deeper truth about HOAs and the unchecked power that can grow inside them. The residents in that room left with more than just frustration. They left knowing they had evidence, proof of what they had endured for so long. And while Reynolds thought he had silenced his critics, what he didn't know was that the world was about to hear their voices louder than ever before. The video didn't stay private for long. Within hours, it was making its way through group chats, email threads, and Facebook neighborhood groups. At first, it was just the homeowners who had been in the room, sending it to friends who missed the meeting. But as people began to realize just how raw and damning the footage was, it spread like wildfire. The clip wasn't edited. It didn't need to be. Every second of Reynolds' sneering face, every cruel jab of his finger, every word laced with contempt stood on its own. There was no way to excuse it as being taken out of context. The context was the entire meeting. And the context was ugly. By the next morning, the video had already gathered hundreds of comments from both residents and outsiders. People who lived in different states chimed in. "This is exactly how my HOA president treats us." Others shared their own horror stories, about fines that made no sense, about rules applied unevenly, about board members who seemed to treat neighbors as enemies instead of equals. The video tapped into a collective frustration, a nationwide sense of being trapped under the thumb of organizations that had forgotten their purpose. Inside the community, reactions were split. Some were relieved. They had felt alone in their complaints, unsure if anyone else noticed the way Reynolds manipulated the board. Now they had proof. Others were hesitant, whispering about retaliation. What if he finds us more? What if they blacklist us from improvements? Fear wasn't irrational. It was the very tool Reynolds had wielded for years, but the video changed the balance. Suddenly, it wasn't just one voice against the board. It was dozens. It was the neighborhood finally speaking in unison. The next board meeting was different. People showed up in numbers so large that the folding chairs weren't enough. Residents stood pressed against the walls, some recording from the moment they walked in. The atmosphere was charged, like a courtroom waiting for the verdict. And in the middle of it all, Reynolds sat at the head of the table, trying to wear the same smug expression, though this time the cracks were obvious. His eyes darted, his posture stiff, his words slower, as though he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. One by one, homeowners stood and spoke. They didn't shout. They didn't insult. They simply told the truth. "I pay dues every month, and I've never felt respected. You laughed at me when I asked for a simple extension. You told me to move if I couldn't afford the fees. That's not leadership. That's cruelty." Each statement was like a stone placed on the scale, tipping it further and further against him. And all the while, the cameras rolled. At one point, Reynolds tried to regain control. He raised his voice, demanding order, banging the gavel against the table. But the room didn't quiet. No one was intimidated anymore. The spell had broken. He wasn't feared, he was exposed. What Reynolds didn't realize was that outside this room, the video had already gained traction on a much larger stage. Local news stations had picked it up, framing it as a story about accountability, about the dangers of unchecked power in small governing bodies. They showed clips of Reynolds leaning across the table, his face twisted in anger, his voice rising as he shouted down residents. And they asked the question that every viewer couldn't help but ask: how many other communities were experiencing the same thing? Neighbors who once kept their distance now found themselves huddled together in shared frustration. There was strength in numbers, and that strength gave them courage. For years, the board had thrived on apathy. Meetings were sparsely attended, and decisions went unchallenged. But now the apathy was gone. The community was awake. It wasn't just about Reynolds anymore. It was about what he represented: the arrogance, the disregard, the sense of untouchable authority. These weren't isolated flaws. They were symptoms of a system that too often allowed individuals to forget they were serving neighbors, not ruling subjects. But even in the face of overwhelming criticism, Reynolds clung to his defiance. He brushed off calls for his resignation, insisting that the video didn't tell the whole story. "It's just a heated moment," he said in interviews, "blown out of proportion by people who don't understand how hard it is to manage a community." His words fell flat. The footage spoke louder than excuses. Meanwhile, the homeowners began to organize. Petitions circulated, demanding a recall vote. Lawyers were consulted to review the HOA's bylaws, searching for clauses that could strip Reynolds of his authority. And as the momentum grew, so did the sense of possibility. For the first time, people believed that change was possible. Behind the scenes, Reynolds' allies on the board grew uneasy. They had once laughed along with him, nodded at his decisions, and backed his authority. But now, with the spotlight burning hot, they began to distance themselves. One board member quietly admitted, "I didn't realize how bad it looked until I saw it on camera." Another resigned altogether, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. The walls were closing in. What made the footage so powerful wasn't just that it showed one man's cruelty. It showed the silence of everyone who had let it happen. And now that silence had consequences, Reynolds could deny, deflect, and spin. But the image was already cemented in the public's mind. A man so intoxicated by a sliver of authority that he forgot the basic decency owed to another human being. As the recall efforts gained steam, whispers began to circulate. Some residents suggested that Reynolds might retaliate in desperation, doubling down on fines, targeting those who spoke against him. Others worried he'd lawyer up and fight tooth and nail to keep his position. But even in the face of these fears, people no longer backed down. They had seen too much. They had endured too long. The next chapter in this story wasn't just about a man exposed. It was about a community learning the power of accountability. The video was more than evidence. It was a mirror that reflected what happens when neighbors stop being neighbors and start seeing each other as obstacles. And in that reflection, people didn't just see Reynolds, they saw themselves, their silence, their hesitations. And they made a decision: never again. The push for a recall gathered speed faster than anyone expected. What had begun as quiet frustration now grew into a movement that spread from kitchen tables to street corners. Neighbors who barely knew one another exchanged stories, united by a single goal: accountability. Flyers appeared tucked into mailboxes. Social media groups filled with strategy discussions and countdowns to the next meeting. For the first time, the HOA board wasn't operating in the shadows of apathy. They were under a glaring spotlight, and the community was watching every step. Reynolds fought back, of course. He always did. He dismissed the recall as a witch hunt, claiming it was orchestrated by a small group of troublemakers. He portrayed himself as the victim, a man unfairly targeted for simply enforcing rules. But the footage told another story, and no amount of spin could erase the image burned into people's minds. A board member leaning across a table, shouting down his neighbor with venom in his voice. What unsettled Reynolds most wasn't the criticism, it was the unity. For years he had relied on division. He pitted neighbor against neighbor, creating a culture where people were too busy fighting each other over minor infractions to challenge the board's authority. But now, those divisions were crumbling. People who had once glared at each other over fence heights or trash bins now stood side by side demanding fairness. And Reynolds had no playbook for this kind of resistance. The recall meeting was set for a Thursday evening. By mid-afternoon, the parking lot outside the community center was already full. Cars lined the streets, and residents streamed in with determination etched on their faces. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. People clutched petitions, legal documents, and phones ready to record. They weren't here just to watch. They were here to act. When Reynolds entered, his usual swagger seemed muted. He wore the same pressed suit, the same practiced smirk, but his eyes betrayed something he couldn't disguise: fear. He sat at the center of the table, flanked by the remaining board members, but for once, the power didn't sit with him. It sat with the crowd. The meeting began with procedural motions, but no one cared. The real moment came when a resident named Claire stepped forward. She wasn't a loud personality, nor had she ever been confrontational. She was known for her kindness, her quiet presence, her willingness to bake cookies for neighborhood events. But tonight, her voice carried weight. She held the microphone firmly. We all saw the video. We all know what happened. This isn't about one heated moment. This is about a pattern. We've been dismissed, disrespected, and mocked for too long, and it stops now. We demand a vote, applause erupted, loud and sustained. Reynolds slammed the gavel, shouting for order, but his voice was swallowed by the noise. The balance of power had shifted completely. The board attempted to stall, citing technicalities and bylaws. But the residents were prepared. They quoted passages from the HOA charter, legal documents highlighted and tabbed for quick reference. Lawyers in the crowd nodded along, confirming the legitimacy of the recall process. Every attempt to block the vote was met with calm persistence. As the minutes dragged on, Reynolds grew visibly agitated. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers. He raised his voice, accused residents of mob mentality, and warned them of chaos if he were removed. But his words landed flat. Chaos was already here, and it wasn't caused by the residents. It was caused by him. Finally, the vote was called. One by one, residents stood to cast their ballots. Some were nervous, some defiant, but all were resolute. Each slip of paper felt heavy, like a piece of history being written in real time. When the last ballot was collected, silence fell. Even Reynolds sat still, his jaw tight as the count began. The result was decisive. Overwhelmingly, the community voted to remove him. The announcement was met with cheers, some residents even breaking into tears. For years, they had endured his contempt, his mockery, his abuse of power. And now, with a single declaration, he was gone. But the story didn't end there, because as much as the recall was about removing Reynolds, it was also about what came next. The community had won a battle, but the war for respect and accountability wasn't over. They still had an HOA to run. They still had rules to enforce. The question was whether they could build something better, or whether they would slip back into the same patterns that allowed Reynolds to thrive. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with a strange energy. Some people celebrated openly, hosting barbecues and waving at neighbors they'd previously ignored. Others remained cautious, wary that the victory might be short-lived. They knew that power doesn't disappear, it shifts. And the challenge would be ensuring it shifted toward fairness, not arrogance. Meanwhile, Reynolds didn't disappear quietly. He lashed out online, posting rants about ungrateful neighbors and character assassination. He threatened lawsuits, claiming defamation, though legal experts dismissed his claims as empty. He even attempted to rally a small group of supporters, but the momentum was gone. His reign was over. What lingered most wasn't his fall. It was the lesson his fall left behind. Residents realized how quickly power can corrupt, how silence enables abuse, and how fragile community becomes when trust is broken. They had lived under those cracks for years, but the video forced them to face it. And in facing it, they changed. For the first time in years, homeowners began talking about the original purpose of an HOA, not to control, but to protect. To ensure safety, to maintain shared spaces, to create a community worth belonging to. They debated openly, sometimes heatedly, but with respect. They voted transparently, documenting every step. They promised each other they would never again allow one person to wield unchecked control. The video that caught Reynolds' behavior had done more than expose him. It had reminded people of something they had almost forgotten. Their voices mattered. As word of the recall spread beyond the neighborhood, other communities took notice. Messages poured in from nearby towns asking for advice, sharing similar experiences. Some even said they were inspired to record their own meetings, to hold their own boards accountable. What happened in one community was sparking a movement in many others. For Reynolds, the end was bitter. For the community, it was liberating. But beneath the celebrations, one truth echoed clearly: Power, no matter how small, reveals character. And when that power is abused, accountability is not just necessary, it is inevitable. The days after Reynolds' removal felt like a long exhale. For years, the community had carried the weight of intimidation, dismissive words and rules enforced with a sneer. Now that weight was lifted. People smiled at one another more often. Neighbors stopped to chat on sidewalks instead of hurrying past. Children played in front yards without their parents nervously scanning for violations. It was as if the neighborhood itself was breathing again, lighter, freer. But beneath that sense of relief was something deeper: responsibility. The residents knew they hadn't just ousted one man, they had reset the balance of power. What they did next would determine whether this was a one-time victory or the beginning of lasting change. At the first board meeting after the recall, the difference was unmistakable. Gone was the air of arrogance that had hovered over the long rectangular table. In its place sat a board that looked nervous, humbled, and most importantly, open. Residents packed the room again, not because they feared abuse, but because they finally felt their presence mattered. This time, voices were heard. A young mother spoke about wanting safer play areas for her kids. Instead of being mocked, she was thanked. An older couple asked about reducing unnecessary fines, and their concerns sparked a real discussion instead of dismissal. Decisions were made in the open, with explanations, with votes that reflected consensus instead of decrees. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was progress. The transformation was more than procedural. It was cultural. The video of Reynolds had become a symbol, not just of what went wrong, but of what they never wanted to return to. It reminded everyone that silence breeds abuse, and that accountability only exists when people demand it. Still, not everyone adjusted easily. A handful of residents grumbled that the board had become too soft, that rules wouldn't be enforced strongly enough. They worried that without a heavy hand, the neighborhood would slide into chaos. But their fears never materialized. Instead, the community found that fairness inspired compliance more effectively than intimidation ever did. When people understood the reasons behind rules, when they felt respected, they were far more willing to follow them. What began as a scandal soon evolved into a story of renewal. The neighborhood's reputation changed. Other communities pointed to it as an example of what happens when people refuse to accept arrogance from their leaders. News outlets that once covered Reynolds' downfall now revisited the story, framing it as one of resilience. From division to unity, how one HOA turned scandal into change, read one headline. And yet, the legacy of Reynolds lingered in a strange way. Not as a wound, but as a warning. His name became shorthand for everything they wanted to avoid. When new board members debated a contentious rule, someone would inevitably say, "Let's not do a Reynolds." It became a reminder that leadership without humility was no leadership at all. For Reynolds himself, the world shrank. His online rants dwindled as interest faded. He was no longer the center of attention, just a bitter man yelling into the void. His threats of lawsuits evaporated when no lawyers took his case seriously. He remained in the neighborhood for a while, but he was a shadow, avoided by many, pitied by some. Eventually he moved away, leaving behind a legacy not of power, but of cautionary tale. The homeowners, however, carried forward something far more valuable, a shared identity. For so long they had thought of themselves as individuals trapped under an oppressive board. Now they saw themselves as a collective force. They learned that accountability didn't come from one person standing up. It came from everyone refusing to sit down. The story of that one video became legend in the community. New homeowners heard it as a kind of initiation, a reminder that this was a neighborhood where voices mattered. Some even said it was the reason they chose to buy there, because they wanted to live in a place where people stood together. And yet the larger lesson went beyond the borders of their neighborhood. It was a truth about power itself, that it reveals character, that it tempts even the ordinary into arrogance, and that it must always be checked by the people it affects. In the end, the video that captured Reynolds' shocking behavior did more than expose a man. It exposed a system, a mindset, a silence, and by shining a light on it, it gave people the courage to step out of that silence. It reminded them that authority, no matter how small, is not a weapon to wield, but a responsibility to honor. that rules are not chains to bind people, but agreements to protect them. That leadership is not about dominance, but about service. The cameras caught one man's fall, but what they really captured was a community's rise, and for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless, every neighbor who had ever swallowed frustration in the face of arrogance, that story became proof that even the smallest voices, when raised together, could change everything. Because in the end, the shocking behavior wasn't Reynolds losing his temper. It was the years of neighbors who stayed quiet, unsure if they could make a difference. The real shock was discovering that they could, and now they never intended to forget it.